Hello, my name is Marenka Thompson-Odlum, and I am a research associate on the Labeling Matters project at the Pitt Rivers Museum and the first guest curator of the University of Cambridge Museum's Museum Remix Unheard project. The first challenge asked of participants was to use sound to creatively interpret objects and their histories, those of which have mostly remained unheard within the museums. Thus, my favorite submissions were those on which multiple levels spoke to the erasure of worlds, cultures, communities, individuals, and ways of knowing in the face of patriarchy and Eurocentric thought. Erasures often perpetuated within the museums themselves. These submissions took me on a journey of both shattering and embracing the silence and silences, and ended with a sentiment of radical hope. My first submission pick is a song titled Unheard by Julia Gambino, in which she gives a voice to the often silenced women in classical art. In this interpretation, the women in the story of the Lapiths and the Centaurs aren't passive participants in their abduction, but heroes in their own story. The line, "I barely remember shattering the air with my arm. I can't forget the feeling that rage I've never had," literally speaks to the moment depicted in the plaster cast when the Lapith woman elbows the centaur. But to me, the words shattering the air also evokes the moment of shattering the silence of these female classical figures as mere objects for male heroism to be acted upon, but also the silencing of sexual assault inherent in the use of the euphemistic term abduction and how these two dynamics are connected. But the imagery of shattering silence also reminded me of the Me Too movement and how underlying those initial images of destruction is also hope.
I may seem to you a little cold, but in my heart I keep the entire world. When I stare at my beloved one's eyes, I see the beauty poets look for in the skies, and it gave me the strength to survive, fighting what irrationality made rise. I felt my body all covered in flames when the centaur's hand showed me no grace. I barely remember shattering the air with my arm. I can't forget feeling that rage that I never had, but I couldn't lose my love so fast. I didn't want to live, and I hoped my heart would last in time, time, time. So what do you know about time in my hands? It is crystallized in an instant of light that will remind you my desperate strength. I may seem to you a little still, but in my chest I keep the same will to live eternally, my beloved one's eyes, where I see the beauty Apollo sings for the skies. And he gave me the strength to fight for civility my ancestors made wise. I felt my body all covered in flames when I saw my sisters fight with divine pride. I won't forget shattering the air with my arm. I'll always treasure that rage that made us free, 'cause we couldn't lose our lives so fast. We didn't want to live, and now I hope in your eyes, my love. I hope my love will live.
My second submission pick, however, reminds me that sometimes what is generally perceived as silence is anything but, and that silence does not always mean that there is a void. Maxine Faye's submission, Afternoon Sounds, interprets an early 20th century plate depicting British Sign Language and English alphabets, reminding us of the everyday sounds that are often taken for granted or tuned out. The soundscape first evokes the imagery of an early 1900s drawing room and then an outdoor scene devoid of oral communication. However, it reminds me that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, and that my dependence on orality momentarily obscured the fact that communication can happen in various ways, and the rustles and sounds of movement could indicate that the silence I had perceived is actually full of communication in the form of signing. The submission actually conjured up a memory of the first time I visited the Starbucks located near Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Yes, a Starbucks. Gallaudet was the first university designed for the deaf community in the US, and thus this particular Starbucks was the first store in the chain to use sign language primarily. The cafe was filled with the clicking of keyboards and the scraping of chairs and the pouring of coffee, and as I approached the baristas, they immediately signed welcome to me, something I didn't understand. In that moment, amidst a hive of communication, none of which I could understand, I had to first realize my positionality and rethink the idea of silence, because amongst this oral silence was a thriving deaf culture.
This is an afternoon in the garden. You can hear the wind. You can hear the road.
My third pick is the soundscape titled Phyllis Wager, A Typewriter's Tale by Lewis Harrower and Andrea Elder. I enjoyed this submission because, like the BSL plate soundscape, It evoked a sense of place. But instead of the warm drawing room and summer garden feeling, I felt the freezing, blistering winds of the Arctic between the clicks of the Remington typewriter. The thought of nearly frozen fingers hitting the key reminds me that apart from the climatic hardships of a polar expedition, Wager and her fellow early female explorers had to contend with a myriad of wildly held doubts of whether women were suited for such work. She most likely had to wonder whether the echoes of her typewriter throughout the Arctic scape would be the loudest reverberations her work would ever make in history, a thought less likely to occur to her male counterparts. In keeping with the idea of pioneers in their fields, my next submission is Transition by John Hodgson. I chose this poem because at its core, while it acknowledges Dorothy Garrett and Frances Turville Petry's intrepidity as respectively being an early female archaeologist and an openly gay archaeologist, it also illustrates how their marginality did not preclude them from imposing Eurocentric ideas, meanings, and terminologies onto the shell and bone necklaces found at the Mar Carmel site in Israel. The echoing of the poem made me think of the various layers of erasure that have surrounded these necklaces, each getting fainter and fainter with time. The erasure is a literal echo left behind, the negative impression referenced by Hodgson, the histories of these necklaces being rewritten by these pioneers, at the very same time that the same patriarchy and Eurocentric systems that erases the necklaces is erasing Garrett and Turville Petry's stories. An erasure that is echoed in my next pick, Not Your Man.
Transition. From the cartoon form springs only received essence, not a being, In outline, she sketches Fig B for plate 4, noting features of the Emira point that differ from the ordinary, asking Natufian innovators to video log Fred and Wilma. From the crafted object fall some uncertainties, but not a purpose. She correlates split bone with anatomy, pins binomial Latin names on shells, perceives herself in a season of sufficiency garlanding the neck of a dead gardener with a decorative conceit. From a hardened thought begins the search for empathy, not understanding. With deft brush and pan, she teases layers of ageless discomfort from part-degraded dust, articulating open hierarchies, unstrung by rotted threads.
My look remains fixed on the middle distance, knowing you will still express me in English, the language of the conqueror, who could not understand the Fafafini light in my storm cloud hair. I am not your man. The last lines from Merriam-Webster's poem encapsulates the epistemicide that occurred during colonization, but also perpetuated by museums. The poem titled Not Your Man directly references the title of the 19th century photos, A Man from Tutuila, Hair Bound and Unbound. In Western thinking, the term man is far from neutral. It is loaded with not only biological but also cultural meaning, bound by strict parameters. As the poem says, the clubs, the weapons, the muscles, and the bristly mustaches of masculinity. In recording the images, it was almost impossible for the photographer, archiver, or curator to see beyond the strict gender binary of man, woman, even when presented with an image of its fluidity. Thus, the Fafafini light or essence as a third gender vanishes from the record. The submission reminds me of Matt Smith's Losing Venus exhibition, in which he acknowledges and explores the impact of colonialism on queer lives across the globe. In his work, we see reflected the various colonial legislations that criminalized the lives that fell outside of gender binaries and heteronormativity in societies where they were once freely lived. The first step of reconstitution is taken in the last line of the poem, I am not your man. Instead, the photo should read, Fafafini from Tutuila.
Not your man. Am I your savage? Is that what you see? Though I hold no club, no machete in hand, no shield or spear or warrior clothes, nothing to tell you I fight for my home. No topknot, no turban. No, you wouldn't recognize if I was a warrior, unless you dressed me up, in your crude costume, and told me to bare my teeth. But I'm no soldier, and no savage neither. Am I your man? My hair is not short. Perhaps we looked the same under the kilt I wore, but I'm not moustached, or bristling and stiff like your officers were when they stepped from the ship. My hair is cut long. I allow it to grow. A braid curls at my shoulder, a tendril of the vine that at the other end of my head buds, a curling ginger flower knotted tight against my skull. But how much richer is my hair when I unloose it into spirals, soft, that shine, reflecting a midday sun that doesn't reach my eyes, but glances off my skin. My still, untensed muscles, far from brutish, are just like your own. I am relaxed. Impassive, I suppose, though the skin I wear isn't white. Even now, when you give me a voice, my look remains fixed on the middle distance, knowing that you'll still express me in English, the language of the conqueror, who could not understand the Fafafine light in my storm cloud hair. I am not your man.
Thank you, everyone, who submitted such great pieces, and it was wonderful being your first guest curator.